Oh, what a beautiful geology. Hello everybody, this is Mini Geology. Yes, what beautiful landscapes in this movie. Fistful of Dynamite. Geology by Landscapes of Sergio Leone. So this is Mini Geology, the weekly radio show about geology and all its derivatives. We put in connection geology with your daily life, with history, with the past, with predictions in the future, with different disciplines, with institutions, policymakers, and all that beautiful stuff that is around you that derives from the rocks and the fluids that are into the rocks. So as you know, many times we talk about these fluids into the rocks. Sometimes it's water, sometimes it's oil, sometimes it's gas. Also today we're going to talk about that, but we're going to put it in the context of the historical point of view of the Mexicans. We're going to talk about the history of oil in Mexico. This year is a historical year, not only just because the Mexican team score 1 goal and win against Germany, the World Cup in soccer, but also because there are elections there, and these people, they are veering and deciding their own history. And after they reform about the energy, the so-called Reforma de la Energía, they are deciding again which is going to be the leader that is going to, in the parliament, that is going to bring them to new horizons. Today we are going to talk about the history of oil in Mexico with Francesco Gerali. Francesco Gerali was with us previously to talk about the general history of oil in the United States and another show talking about Australia. So today Francesco, who's a senior research fellow at the Oil and Gas, Mineral Sources and the Energy Center in the University of Oklahoma, and he's in Oklahoma right now. He's going to talk about Mexico. And dear Francesco, are you there with us? Do you want to explain us why you want to talk about Mexico? How comes that you know so much about the history of oil in Mexico?
Hello, Daniel. Good evening. Nice to be here with you again, your radio show. Very happy. Thanks to invite me again. And what about Mexico? Well, I know something about Mexico. I did some research between 2011 and 2014 when I was actually working physically, living and working in Mexico. I was a postdoctoral fellow, postdoctoral researcher at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, the Research Institute of Geography, where I was working with Luz Fernanda-Azuela Bernal, professor of history of science and technology. She was very focused on history of the geosciences in Mexico in the 18th, 19th centuries. To work together, and my focus was the development of the early oil industry, the early oil finding in Mexico.
So, where do you want to start? How far back are you going to bring us?
Well, let's say that if we want to give a brief view over 500 centuries, we need to be concise and touch the very important points.
We're going to start with the conquistadores?
Very briefly, let's say that oil was in the early chronicles of the history of Mexico, or at the time, in Nahuatl language, Mexica, because the early explorers, describing the richness of the flora and fauna in Mexico, they observed oil. And especially they observed these large mounds of bituminous oil called chapopoteras, because the bitumen was called chapoput. And all the description that we have from that age, pretty much they are identical to the several descriptions that we found in Europe, in many other countries of the early oil in the antiquity. I mean, chapopote was the very original native Mexican term to call the oil, spontaneous fusion of oil, all over Mexico. The early Mexicans, they used oil pretty much along the 16th century, 17th century, 18th century, as it was used in Europe, as it was used there in the United States, in Canada. Basically, it was a raw substance used for carpentry, masonry, construction, as ink. But there was just a very important 100% Mexican utilization of the thick bitumen, the Gamme 1. It was used as chewing gum.
Say
and
again?
Also,
what was
chewing gum. Yes, it was chewed, like we chew a gum or chewing tobacco. And it was used that, believe it or not, to polish the teeth. Basically, it was a kind of natural toothpaste, because it was so gummy at the same time. At an effect, it was kind of grasping in between the teeth. So it was a kind of natural cosmetic to keep the mouth clean. This is 100% a Mexican feature. In no other countries you can find that in the oil in the antiquity.
And Francesco, do you remember, do you know where these chapopoteras were found geographically?
Geographically, good question. Were spread really all over Mexico. In the south, in the area of the today Tabasco, in the today Veracruz, Hidalgo, Mexico had an important characteristic. It was that was detected by many chronicles. Basically, the largest number of chapopoteras, or pounds of oil and bitumen, the larger number in compared with the extension of the territory. It was the country with the largest number of spontaneous fusion pounds spring of oil ever recorded in history.
Okay.
Basically, oil was around the people everywhere, and there is also a story that the properties, the farms, the lands with too much chapopoteras were considered inconvenient and cheap. You know why?
No.
Because the wind put the dust, leaves, grass, and whatever over the surface of the chapapotera, semi-solid. The cattle, horses, they walked over, and they had a very bad sort, like a quicksand.
I see.
So it was also dangerous for the activity of the cattle. Basically, if we want to find an early comparison with the U.S., when the salt domes in the U.S. were dug and found mixed with oil, with a black liquid, that deposit of salt was completely useless because it was wasting that activity. In Mexico, down south, in the agricultural activities, they had the problem of the Chapapotera. Era basically bitumen/quicksand.
Obviously, then the people, they didn't exploit it until they knew what was going on in the northern part of the continent. When in 1859, we know there is this boom, economic boom, where we finally understand how to use this oil as a source of energy. So, can you bring us back to Mexico in 1859? What does it happen while in the United States we have the economic boom of the oil?
Sure. So we are in Mexico, 1859, late 1859. At the moment in Mexico, oil was just taken from the Chapapoteras. In that moment was still working in the Mexican law system, the so-called Ordenanza de Minería, I mean the mining code from 1783. So it was a pretty old law, but it was important because this code was the first to mention that at the time Spanish crown had the right on the exploitation of the Chapapoteras. Even oil was considered a mine property of the crown. Between 1861 and 1862, we had 10 times the value in US dollars of oil imports from the United States to Mexico. So Mexico was immediately, let's say, conquered by the US oil from Pennsylvania, Ohio, and New York. Mexico discovered the meaning, the possible meaning of the importance of the oil in the country. So this is the turning point. The US exports of oil in Mexico.
Let's put it in a political context now. The things that are going on in this end of the 1800s.
Sure. This is a very important step in the Mexican oil sector, Mexican oil culture. Mexico, in that moment, part of the country was under the control of the French troops of Napoleon III, and was imposed as Emperor Maximilian from the Austria, from the Austrian Empire. Maximilian was the manager, let's say, of the North Italian territories controlled by the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was offered to be Emperor of Mexico under the backing, the coverage of the French army. It is a pivotal and important moment in the Mexican economy, in the Mexican culture, because in spite of the title of Emperor, Maximilian was really a liberal, a far-sighted man that wanted to develop Mexico in many fields, many sectors, and one of those was oil. The government of Maximiliano prepared the first code only specifying, only regarding oil and how to exploit oil, the rights on oil, and whatever is related to the oil mining activity.
So
we are between 1864 1865, and this is a...
How comes that Maximiliano, coming from Austria, he knows about the geology of Mexico and the resources of Mexico?
The knowledge was very, very poor. And to give you an example, early local entrepreneurship in Mexico, this in 1863, we have a witnessing record. In 1862, 1863, they sent a sample of oil in New York, United States, to be studied, analyzed. Because in Mexico there was a lack of laboratories, of know-how, of people that was capable to say that if this chapapote, this oil, was bad or good. So we can note first a dependency from the oil imports from the U.S., and second, we see that they needed U.S. expertise to understand a little bit the general panorama. But it's important to state that 1864, 1865, Mexico was looking really forward, was looking with big ideas to the future. Because even this code on oil mining, from 1864, 1865, was very much more advanced than the mining code of many other European countries.
And so we are in very important years because 1864, 65, those are the years of the Civil War in the United States. Any relationship between Civil War in the northern part of the continent and this thing going on in Mexico? Important
and pivotal. First, let me say a note that is connected to these relations. The government Mexican, Maximiliano, paved the way to businessmen to bid on oil concession, to get oil rights. And the Mexican government received 66 requests and then awarded 35 entrepreneurs. Many of them from Spain, many of them Mexican, and some of them from the United States. So let's keep this note here at the side. The extent of the relations. Well, as we know, as you said, the United States in that moment were divided in blue jacket and gray jacket. Let's say that. Even Mexico was divided. Because in the north side of Mexico, there was the exiliated government of Benito Juárez, and in the center south there was this new formed empire that was backed, was resisting thanks to the troops of the French Napoleon I. What happened? The Blue Jackets were very disappointed about the French army in Mexico. They were totally against this occupation, considering on regard of the Doctrine Monroe. Doctrine Monroe, in few words, said the United States of America will never allow any kind of influence to the American continent, from any other European country. So, in that sense, the Blue Jackets, they decide to tie an alliance with the liberals of with the original government that was the opposite of Benito Juárez.
Benito Juárez.
Pardon. On the other hand, the Confederacy, the Gray Jackets, in response to this situation, they tied an alliance with the French and Maximilian the Emperor. So in the local trade, you can find a lot of notes about the propaganda of Maximilian supporting the cause of the southern states, fighting with the northern states, with the big neighbor north. And at the same time, here we find an important connection, speaking about oil. When the people of Juarez was in delegation tying alliances with the state in the north, the U.S., exactly where in New York, they started to sell oil concessions. They already said before the end of the war, when we will have everything tied up in Mexico, when we will have defeated finally the invasion of the invasion, we would like to start to trade oil concessions or territories with the state of the United States. But the problem was many of the same concessions were already given and awarded by the Emperor Maximilian to other people already working in Mexico. So basically there was a situation where people was maneuvering, people was moving piece of paper, concessions, official government seals, but just on the paper, based on nothing. Because basically no one was working the land, no one in New York was sure of the extent of the concession that people could acquire or not. So there are a lot of ties and interesting histories that now we have not the time to repeat. But what happened is that.
Yeah.
What happened is that in 1865, the northern state defeated the Confederacy. The United States found again their union. In that year, 66, 67, in Mexico, we had still the empire. Mexico was still the empire. So we have many stories of the former soldiers of the Confederacy migrating to Mexico, moving to Mexico to restart a new life in Mexico, because they preferred to live the southern states better than stay down the new reunified United States government.
So
this is an important story of migration in the 19th century.
Okay, so at the end of the 19th century, we had the Americans that they lost the Civil War emigrating from the north to the south.
And one of them, this is another one of the interesting stories that we can depict. One of them was Colonel O'Bannon, that was the Palmetto, first the Palmetto Regiment, and then was a captain in the cavalry of South Carolina. He decided to move in Mexico, and he then took the chance to try to exploit, to open an oil company together with other businessmen, local and Americans, in the state of Veracruz, in the area of Papantla. And that is an important landmark, the area of Papantla. But this is another story.
So, but are you telling us that the Americans that immigrated to the south, they had a role in the development of the oil industry in Mexico? Or they were like generally just immigrants, that they just went on a different kind of business unrelated with the oil and gas?
Okay, about the level, the technical and scientific level of the oil industry in Mexico, we can say that basically was very, very low, very low. Indeed, during the empire, when the empire fallen in 67, basically no drilling, no oil operation, nothing was started. Basically it was a big speculative bubble, just a signs on papers and seals, but no one moved a finger. The level was very low. And we see again this very low level in a new moment, the years, the 60s, the 70s. In this year, other companies, especially from the U.S., with the U.S. capital, started to rise. Also, the geography of oil changed, because it was no more Veracruz and Tabasco, so the southeast. Now we have people looking for oil also in the state of Oaxaca, on the Pacific coast. So the oil geography of Mexico expanded, but the oil production of Mexico is something more virtual and mythologic than real fuel barrels of oil.
So when is that in Mexico we have the development of the oil and gas industry? When does it happen?
Well, we need to wait the very early 20th century. There are few reasons, there are several reasons why this didn't happen earlier, because we have again in between the late, let's say during the 80s, we have a new wave of U.S. companies try to explore for oil. Again, between 1894 and 1901, 1900, we have another wave, but they were ineffective. And before to, if you allow me 3 minutes, no more, before to explain when the industry started to produce, I would like to give you some notes why we had 40 years of gap between the first momentum, the Maximilian Empire, and then the real production. But I would like to tell you what happened, or at least try to give you some note about what happened between 1865, 1868, and 1900.
Oh, of course, go ahead.
We had Mexico inverted, submerged by the huge flow of oil from the Standard Oil Company. The giant Octopussy was also in Mexico since the very early 1880s with a company that was taking care of the business. And this company was the Water Pierce, and that the specific geography was the let's say the agency for the Standard Oil for at the time Oklahoma, Louisiana, Kansas, Texas, with a special permit to work in exclusive in Mexico. So first, Mexico was totally fueled with U.S. oil, very cheap oil. And that was a gap, because to start a new industry from the scratch, like it was the Mexican one, well, were needed many capitals. That was, and you have to wait at least 5-6 years before you find probably a real income. That was a huge investment, and was better to sell, to become an agent of the Water Pierce and to commercialize the U.S. oil. So the very low cost imports literally prevented in part the development of a real industry, not just the craft activity. But the more important aspect is another, is the environment of Mexico in that years. As I mentioned, between 1887 we have several U.S. companies that tried. They wanted to take the chance. They were the investor. But the problem was the Mexican environment. I tell you this. Do you remember, Daniel, I know that you love history. Do you remember why the Napoleon troops and then the German troops, they failed to invade Russia?
Oh, we're going back in time now.
Yeah, just an excursus, just to make an example.
Oh, we're going back to the Mr. Winter.
And then the German troops during the Second World War didn't make it to invade the Russian bear. Why?
Yeah, the Mr. Winter.
General Winter. General Winter. Well, in Mexico, when I decided that it was time to get the people sometimes laugh during an oral presentation, not just to get bored or falling asleep, I decided to use the term General Chapopote. What means General Chapopote? It means that too many random perforations yield just a few and poor strikes and many too much dry wells. Why? No geological knowledge. People was just drilling aside of the oil pounds, chapapoteras. But you are an oil geologist and you teach me that the presence of a chapapotera, so the oil pound, doesn't necessarily imply that down under you find an oil deposit.
Yeah, very, 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 very knowledgeable on that, yes.
Another important was the harsh life conditions. We have many witnessing American oil workers, oil drillers, that were getting very sick in Mexico. For example, there was the problem of the yellow fever in the oil field. So it was very dangerous, even for the same drillers that wanted to go and to start a business. Was difficult for them to stay there. And the more important, another pattern that ties Mexico with many other countries was the lack of way of communication. Transports were slow and very expensive. There were no roads. To, let's say, open the way to many of the future oil fields, at that time people had really to open roads in the jungle with machete. The only way to commerce, to transport pretty cheap was the waterway, where the several rivers. But not often. You know that Mexico is a country with a lot of problems with water in many areas. So here we find another time the pattern of the logistic. One of the very lucky conditions in Pennsylvania, northwestern Pennsylvania, was the availability of roads, of railroads, and then the immense power of the waterways. In Mexico, we find the lack of the logistic. That was a great problem. So, resuming, Daniel, sorry, I'm going probably over my goal. Resuming, the huge imports of oil refined from the U.S., plus general chapopote, that all the conditions that I mentioned, were preventing Mexico in 19th century to boom, to start a real national industry, and we need to wait the very early 20th century to see a real change.
It almost coincides with the 901 first well that we have here in Boma, in Texas.
Well, on a way, it is definitely connected because there is an important connection, but I will explain you shortly. But yes, as already mentioned in the previous talks we had, Beaumont 1901 is a landmark. Was the demonstration that oil is huge. The power of oil is magnificent. It was a demonstration that it is possible to find giant deposits. It is possible to make business. Oil is a kind of lymph for the society, and doing oil business is important. So this is one of the many meanings of 1901 Beaumont. But for sure, that discovery, considering that many people was observing the geology of Texas and then the neighborhood Mexico, most people was thinking, well, if we have oil very close to the border on our side, for sure we are going, probably, but they were pretty confident to find oil on the other side. In that moment, we have new partners in oil in Mexico. Not more just U.S. companies, like the investments of Doheny from California at Lebanon, but we have also important interest from Great Britain. And this is an important chapter because first Great Britain decided, this company that was called then El Águila, decided to bring a British geologist that was Geoffrey Jeffrey, that was basically the name of the very first Western geology that did prospecting for oil geology, oil in Mexico, and studied the oil geology of Mexico between 1902 and 1906. Basically, he is the real first and less known name. response, this British company, El Águila, the Eagle, decided to use this British geologist, but then hired very important names from the United States, like White, Ikes, and this was 1908, 1909, and then decided to was invited also the young Everett Lee de Golyer. Everett Lee de Golyer, native from Kansas and educated in Oklahoma, was a student of geology at the University of Oklahoma, was a Sooner. He was neither graduated, that he needed money basically, so few classes before the graduation decided to go to make some money to work in Mexico. And this guy really made a revolution in Mexico. Not a coincidence that our colleague Houston Mount from the East Central Oklahoma University in Ada defined de Golyer an oil-filled revolutionary and wrote a very, very interesting book in 2014, Houston Mount. Basically, he unveiled important knowledge, he wrote important pages, and in 1910, he found the first great big gusher in Mexico that was comparable to, tell me to which?
Spindletop?
Correct, Daniel, correct.
Oh.
Mexico, thanks to the study of Geoffrey, the intervention of geologists from the United States Geological Service, and the art and the luck of finding oil of the Golyer, we had a kind of Spindletop in 1910, around, was Christmas time, yes, Christmas vacation.
Mm.
In Mexico, in the state of Veracruz, in the famous area of La Huasteca.
I see. So,
by the way, sorry, I forgot, for the chronicles, Potrero de Llano, well number 4. It's an important number, the number 4.
Potrero de Llano.
Correct.
Is there any relationship now with what happened in 1910 in the 1914, 1915 first hiccups of revolution in Mexico?
Sure. What happened? Well, Mexico, between 1911 and 1912, gained the first place in the ranking of the oil producer countries. In a couple of years, Mexico beaten Austria-Hungary, Romania, and all the other producing countries were producing even more than the camps of Sumatra and Borneo, the Dutch dominions in the southeast. And there was also a moment in Mexico, and this is very important to keep in mind, in which in 1917, 1918, Mexico ranked second oil producer in the world, just behind the U.S. You know why happened that, Daniel?
Well, what we call 1917 for our age, that it coincided with the Russian Revolution.
Exactly, because Russia was the second. Good guess, correct. So it happens that during the, let's say, the years of the revolution, the subsequent disruption of the activities in Russia. So October 1917, 18, and 1919. The production in the Russian Caucasus fields was a disaster. The interest of the Rockefellers, the interest of the Krupps, the interest of the Nobel family, the Rothschild, the 4 big names of the oil were completely whipped out from the revolution. But talking about oil and revolution, by the way, Oil and Revolution is the title of probably the first greatest book written by Professor Jonathan Brown, Texas University in Austin in 1993, Oil and Revolution. Talk about oil and revolution with Mexico is a kind of paradox, and I explain you why.
Wait a second. Before oil and the revolution, the oil, so we are in between 1910 and the very first revolutionary movement in Mexico, so 1914, let's say.
Exactly.
So in these years, who was producing and benefiting economically from these wells? Were they private companies? Were they American companies?
Okay, good question. Okay. Yes, let me give you the panorama, and then I explain you why I consider a paradox to talk about oil and revolution in Mexico in comparison with the other revolutions, for example, the Russian one. Okay, in Mexico at that moment we had many U.S., French, and overall British companies. In that moment there were a lot also of Mexican capitals, so it was a kind of very heterogeneous situation. In Mexico at the time we had refining, logistic, drilling, everything is going on. Mexico now is an engine, is a wood-12 spinning full round without problems. In that moment, the law in that moment was a very liberal law and said that the proprietor, the owner of the land is also the owner of what there is down under. So if you own the land, you have all the mineral rights. So there was a huge run to buy from all the companies, Mexican companies, foreigner companies, to buy the lands. And basically this law, they allowed these people to pay just a very low tax and something like very ridiculous amount of royalties, because the interest of the Mexican government at the moment was we need to develop the industry, we need to give to Mexico a direction. We can't more rely just on silver. We have very poor coal. We have a lot of other minerals, but now the profits come from oil. This was the reason. As you mentioned earlier, Daniel, yeah, we have also the revolution in Mexico. It was a very difficult situation, a very difficult revolution. I'm not going to talk now about political questions. It's not my line of research. But what I can say is that the paradox in Mexico is that during the revolution, Mexico was producing more, and more. So while in Russia, during the revolution, it was a crack, a bankruptcy, and why in Mexico during the revolution was around the oil fields, we had an increase. Because basically, the oil areas owned especially by foreigner companies, they needed at some point to bribe the revolutionaries. Sometimes a band of people from the revolution knock at the door, the oil fields, and say, well, I think that you need protection. Well, actually, I'm feeling protected. No, you are not protected. You need protection. And so basically, oil money made a miracle. For the first time, oil in the history, oil is magnificent for many things, for many reasons. Oil in Mexico, the oil system in Mexico was capable to detain the troubles of a revolution. While in Russia, all the system was cracked down, the political, social, labor system was in complete agony. In Mexico, the oil interests were so strong, was so important, that the people in the oil fields started to find a deal, decided to dialogue with the people in the revolution to say, the only thing that we want to do here is business. What's your number? What's your price? Let me in peace. Leave me alone. And they made it. They made it, and they made it, and they made it.
I see.
This is the Mexican paradox when you talk about revolution.
I see. And so this is also what happened, like just a couple of years before the Mexican Constitution is written in the same year, 1917, same year of the Russian Revolution, right? So is this the background to write down those articles in the Mexican Constitution that they protect the resources, the energy resources in the subsurface?
Correct. Actually, the history, it's another important chapter. Unfortunately, we can't describe now, but the history of the oil legislation in Mexico is very fascinating. In 1917, and then later, we find now a complete turn. Now, oil is in the soil is property of the state. Then started after 1917, then 1920, started the system as we know it today. So the modern legislation of the oil in Mexico, yes, started with after the revolution in 1917, 1918, 1920. This is another watershed for the legal history of the energy resources in Mexico.
Why do you think that the legislation on oil or energy resources in general in Mexico is so peculiar?
Because it's very peculiar, the approach of Mexicans with oil.
Tell us about that. I think this is an important point, especially because now we are approaching so much this reforma energética that occurred in 2013, 2014.
Okay, let's do that, Daniel, but I think that we have probably no more than 9 minutes. So let me say that Mexico was also important, just a brief parenthetical. After 1920, Mexico was an important trampoline for U.S., British companies to start a new business in Latin America. Mexico was a great training field for the American and British companies, and was also the ground where important oil geologists, oil scientists like Dempsey Belt, originally from Missouri, and OU is a Sooner, is an OU alumni. Young people like Belt gained experience in Mexico and then moved to be oil managers, oil directors, chief executives of U.S. companies that opened their branches, their interest in Latin America. So this is also the importance of Mexico. It was a training field. But the peculiar feeling of Mexicans, why? Well, from the 20s, we jumped to 1938. The situation in Mexico was hot, but not for the weather, for the political climate. General Lázaro Cárdenas, in that moment the president, decided, with a shock announcement, somewhat awaited and feared, decided the official expropriation, or they call it nationalization, of the Mexican oil industry. Basically, oil was promoted to element of national proudness.
Why does it happen?
Oil in Mexico is patriotism. Because President Lázaro Cárdenas, decided to take over all the businesses of all the foreigner oil companies. Basically, with a snap, Lázaro Cárdenas put the hands over $1 billion at that time of oil shares, oil business,
do you
oil
think
money.
That was related to an economic turmoil and turndown, or was it mainly like by principle?
Basically, Mexico in that moment was experiencing not a good situation, and economically speaking, and Mexico had a lot of loans with other countries that was the time to give back. So in that moment, also Mexico was in a kind of political situation that was needed, at least was supposed to be needed, a strong man making strong actions, and very patriotic actions. So this class of politicians, that basically was a class of former military people that in some way elected themselves, they shouted from the balcony, Mexican oil is only for Mexicans, and what we have to do now is to develop our oil industry. That was a kind of important revolution, because it was the first time that an oil country was officially kicking out the real proprietors, the people that were actually owning the rights of exploration, refineries, machineries, and whatever. So in that sense, in the Mexican culture, the March 18, 1938, is a kind of meaning that may remember the 4th of July, an inner flame of independence, an inner new flame of enthusiasm about your flag, your national party.
So is kind of the oil becomes a symbol for emancipation for the entire country and people. But Francesco, tell us your point of view of what happens later on. So is this a good move now, so many decades later, for the economy of Mexico? Because this is something that is intimately related with what happened in 2013, 2014, where the Mexican people with their representative in the parliament, they had to do an energy reform again.
Well, let me say that it's a long story, but let's be dry. Already 20 years later, the expropriation, there was a group of Mexican economists making a shocking proposal. The proposal was it should be better probably to call back the foreigner companies to work out directly the oil fields, because apparently in 20 years they cracked a system that worked for almost 40 years, until 1938. So in that moment started a new age for the Mexican oil industry. There was the only concessionary for the state, that is Pemex, Petroleros Mexicanos, and they have the exclusive on the soil. They do everything on behalf of the Mexican state, and Pemex is 100% Mexican. But they can use contractors. They can use other companies in exchange of royalties. So basically, the Mexican system was, this is Mexican. This is managed 100% by Mexicans. But I call you as external. You work for me. You don't work on my land using my property. You are just making a service to me. This was since then the policy of Mexico, and there is also an important exchange on how, when I was in Mexico, I met a brilliant geophysicists, oil engineers, oil geologists that studied in many colleges in the United States. So there is many of the machineries used in offshore, for example, are machineries from Germany. So virtually the Mexican power on the industry has always been on the property of the land. But in practical terms of production, well, there is still a thick cord of a Manila rope, let's say, that ties Mexico to the forerunner oil systems in terms of science and technology. Yes.
All right, Francesco, thank you very much for all of this exhaustive explanation of the history of oil in Mexico that went back to los conquistadores españoles and reached almost the Energía de la Reforma of 2013. Certainly, we talk until the late 50s, 1950s. So this is a mini geology radio show from KPFT, Houston, HD2 channel. This is Daniel Minizini, your inquisitive geologist. We had today Francesco Gerali from University of Oklahoma. And if you want to listen to this program again, you can go to minigeology.com, or you can write us to minigeology@gmail.com. Francesco, thank you very much.
Thank you very much to you, Daniel. I really enjoyed our time. Thanks. Have a good evening.
Bye.
Bye-bye.